Speaking with Douglas Lumsden MSP, Douglas Lumsden MSP, Shadow Secretary, Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero, Energy and Transport. Thank you for sitting down with...
No problem, Dee. No problem at all.
We've got a lot to talk about, and let's start with something that myself have written articles about. Others, such as Harry Clinch at the Disruption Banking, have written about the Scottish National Investment Bank. Now, the best place to start, I suppose, would be to focus on the questions you have been raising, and then we'll pivot to the issues that have been raised in our reporting, and we'll dig into it and get your thoughts. So back in November 6th, 2023, you asked a series of questions that were quite useful. You asked the Scottish Government when it will provide an update on the establishment of an advisory group as required by Section 29 of the SNIB Act. You also asked whether members of said advisory group would be paid, if not, if so, what levels, and also about recruitment processes. Now, Neil Gray at the time, he answered in November 15th, quote, details such as membership, recruitment and appointment processes, remuneration, meetings frequency remain under consideration. We will provide an update for this work in 2024. I notice in December 29th, 2023, you asked a further question if the Scottish Government had any meetings with SNIB to discuss alleged cases of conflict of interest in relation to employees whilst involved in SNIB investments with external companies. Now, we'll come on to that in a second, but let's focus on the questions from November. About the advisory board being set up, whether there'd be pay, what the process is. Now, you did get, the Scottish Conservatives did push this in May the 7th this year, because to my understanding, there had not been any update so far this year. Right. So Scottish Conservatives pressed for more information in relation to those three questions about the advisory board, etc. Mary McCallan answered this time, saying, quote, work to establish the group is ongoing. Discussions on membership around membership and appointments, process and meetings frequency are taking place, and announcements will be made in the coming months. So, are you satisfied with any of these answers?
No, because it's the same answers we've been receiving for the last 18 months or so now. You know, this is an advisory board that was meant to be in place a long time ago, and it just seems like the Scottish Government are kicking the can down the road with it. And it's, for me, it's not as if it's a board that's not necessary. You know, there's huge amounts of public money going through SNIB, and I think it's only, you know, the advisory board was put in legislation for a reason, for the oversight to make sure that that money was being spent correctly. So if that's not in place, you would imagine, well, is it being spent correctly? Who's deciding whether it's going to be spent correctly or not? Is government ministers have oversight? They claim not to. So, you know, it should definitely be there. You know, this is not a scout group or something that is meant to have some sort of board there. This is, you know, the Scottish National Investment Bank with huge amounts of money going through it. And for this not to be in place just seems to be a complete dereliction of duty. And the answers I've been getting back is really frustrating. And you know, I keep thinking, oh, should I keep going with it? And you know, I will keep going with it until it's put in place, or the change in legislation to remove it. You know, it's back to the point, there was a reason for it being put in there. So I don't understand why it hasn't been done.
The purpose of this advisory board was to provide oversight into the operations, investments, etc. of the SNIB. This is, for the audience, we're not talking about a high street bank where you deposit money and get money back. This is an investment bank. This is designed to make strategic investments to help Scottish startups, long-term investment, grow the economy. One could argue it's one of the few things in the era of the well-being economy that the Scottish Government have done that might be pro-business in any way. And so, as you say, it's not a scout group. Why is... Now, we're not mind readers. What could be the reason for such a lengthy delay? Because the SNIB Act was 2020. We're now well into 2024, and there's still no advisory group.
Yeah.
And this matters because Scottish Government ministers do have day jobs. They don't have times to be conducting the kind of forensic oversight that this advisory group is supposed to do to keep an eye on taxpayers' money being invested via SNIB. So why the delays and why the recalcitrance to actually...
Yeah, I can't understand the delays. And, you know, I sit on the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee, and we've had the SNIB into committee, and I've asked them the questions as well, why there's no advisory board. But, you know, rightly, they say it's the Scottish Minister's responsibility to set that advisory board up. And if I was the Scottish Ministers, I would be thinking having that advisory board in place would be a good thing. That would almost protect me from the day-to-day running of the bank. So if there was any investments that maybe weren't correct, then, you know, they would have the comfort to say, well, that was the advisory board that did that. You know, that's what they're there to do. And, you know, if it wasn't correct, then they would go and look at how that advisory board was working. But while that's not there, it really rests on the shoulders of the Scottish ministers. So I can't understand why they're kicking this down the road. You know, we've had multiple changes to the head of the SNIB. So if they can recruit new chief execs, why can't they just put this board together? It's almost like I don't know, they're trying to not do it out of spite or something. I don't really understand why they're not doing it, because I feel it could, you know, it would provide a level of protection for Scottish ministers that they don't have just now, and they're actually leaving themselves exposed by not having that board in place.
And yeah, we aren't mind readers, I suppose, but it does raise questions. Is it a question of reluctance politically because they're being pressured, or is it there are too many other fires the Scottish Government currently need to fight that they've not been focused on this? It is interesting because focusing on oversight, there are reasons to desire more oversight in relation to the SNIB and accountability with taxpayers' money. Now, coming back to the December 29th, 2023 question, asked if Scottish Government had any meetings with the SNIB to discuss any alleged cases of conflict of interest. This would be in relation to employees of the SNIB working for the SNIB whilst the SNIB is making investments with companies that these employees have involvement with externally. Now, at the time, Neil Gray gave you an answer, quote, ScotGov routinely discusses a range of matters with the bank, including its approach to governance, risk, procedures, managing conflicts of interest.
Mm-hmm.
And the bank's investment decisions are overseen by the investment committee, who rigorously and objectively assess each business case on its commercial merits, quote. Now, I find that answer very interesting because I remember, and I know you're aware of the reporting, Harry Clinch, who's features editor at Disruption Banking. He's done excellent work on this.
Yeah.
And I interviewed him. I've also written articles myself about this. And there are issues about potential, not saying there are, potential conflicts of interest, which have not been properly addressed in terms of answers. And also questions around the risk management of the bank internally. Now, we'll start with the risk management thing. Now, back, of course, Neil Gray specifically mentions investment committee who rigorously, objectively assess each case, governance, the Scottish Government discuss governance risks, blah, blah, blah. So let's focus on that. Harry Clinch and myself have reported that the SNIB senior executive Eddie McAvinci is said of risk management committees, they're, quote, terrible. I'll give the full quotation for transparency. Quote, SNIB senior exec Eddie McAvinci quote, some of what DC, the former head of investment, said is just rubbish. Our committee processes are terrible here. I think Risk are screwing this up.
Yeah.
What concerns should we have about that?
Yeah, and for me, Dean, that would be part of the role of the advisory board, to be looking at issues that have been raised, questions that have been raised, to actually look at the governance of the bank to make sure it was doing the right thing. And I find it a bit strange. To be fair, it's only yourself and Harry that have been raising these issues for a long time, and I've been submitting questions normally on the back of that. But there's questions being raised. Now, everything might be in order, but surely that would be the job of the advisory board, to provide that level of assurance that the government should be looking for when they're spending huge amounts of money. Now, because there's been question marks around some of their investments. Obviously, there was the investment that went wrong around after the DRS scheme collapsed, and I think that's why that advisory board is so key. And I think another role for that advisory board would actually be to make sure there's not any interference from government ministers in terms of where that money is being lent. It's meant to be independent from the Scottish ministers and the Scottish government. So that advisory board should surely be a two-way thing to make sure the investments are right and are following the aims of the bank, but also to make sure there's no undue influence from Scottish ministers and where that money is being directed to also. And maybe, I'm not suggesting anything, but it could be that maybe one of the reasons why there's a reluctance to have that advisory board in place.
As a personal aside, my own personal opinion as an opinion writer, I've long had the suspicion that a feature of the Sturgeon era, Humza Yousaf era, now continuity 3.0 with the new First Minister, John Swinney, control and letting go of control is a feature, not a bug, of governance process. Even beyond the kind of politics like this, it's even a criticism that you hear from Yes campaigners. And I'm no Yes campaigner, but they criticise the SNP as a party, an instinctive control obsession, which across the board seems to be a common criticism from all sides. Now, in relation to the independence, you mentioned the DRS debacle. It was really revealing because SNIB head honchos, of course, went up to Holyrood, and they basically said, well, and this gets again about judgment, risk management, etc. And they basically said, well, maybe, I suppose we could be generous, there was perhaps naivety that legislation by government could be treated as copper bottoming in terms of risk. What does that say to you as an MSP about the future credibility of Holyrood government and the law officers who are supposed to say that if a legislation is legal, advise before it gets to legislative final legislative phases? What is this?
No, and we've got to, I'm sitting on the committee just now that's looking at the circular economy bill. And for me, there could be big sort of question marks around that in terms of UK Internal Market Act once again. And it seems to be the stance of the Scottish Government that they're going to push that legislation through and then discuss with the Office of the UK Internal Market Act whether it's right or not. And we'll be putting through sort of amendments to that to try and make sure that a lot of that discussion takes place up front. Because you're right, it was, I would say, a bit naive by SNIB that they took their assurance that, well, it's been passed by law, so it's fine. But as we've seen with so much of the law coming through the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament just now, it's actually bad law. We've got the Hate Crime Act, we had the Offences at Football Act that had to be repealed because it was such bad law, and there seems to be more and more of that taking place. And I think it's because, drifting away slightly, the committee structure we have in the Scottish Parliament is, I would say, not robust enough. There's still too much voting down political lines. There's still a lot of MSPs on committees that will just do as they're told by the whips in the Scottish Parliament. Now, there is exceptions to that. I used to sit on the Finance Committee, and I must admit, the SNP members on that, with Michelle Thompson, with Kenny Gibson as chair, with John Mason, they genuinely went in there to make sure that what they were passing at committee was right and could actually do what it said on the tin. So there is exceptions to it, but most MSPs sitting on committees, it's just like they're handed a script by the whips and they'll just do as they're told. And that's not how Parliament should work. It's
always safer to name the names that you're going to praise, because we all know the names that don't deserve it. But yeah, coming back to the SNIB, in regards to the more concerning aspect, putting aside, I suppose, linked to risk management, this issue about Scottish Government ministers talk regularly, according to Neil Gray, about government risk procedures, managing conflicts of interest. So, one example that Harry Clinch and myself have reported on is an example that we know of an employee investing externally, raising potential, not saying it is, there could be very innocent answers, but potential conflicts of interest. For example, what was it? SNIB made a taxpayer-funded investment of £7.5 million into a loss-making firm that had not filed company accounts for 2 years, as of the last time I checked, which was December. So just so happened, it turned out, when we did digging, that the firm in question was run by the brother of an SNIB employee. That's just one example of concerns, which are legitimate, that are being raised. So do you think the Scottish Government's eye is on the ball about these potential conflicts of interest? Because this is just one example. There have been others raised in the report. Do you think the Scottish Government is liaising with the SNIB, asking about this, seeking clarifications?
No, no, their eyes clearly not on the ball, and it's almost like they've put them at an arm's length and don't want really anything to do with it. They'll fund it every year when it comes to budget time, but in terms of the running and in terms of the governance and in terms of the scrutiny, they just want to just leave it alone and forget about it. But they can't really do that. Especially, you mentioned that a committee meeting that I was on earlier this year when SNIB were in there, and so there is levels of investments but are questionable, especially when you look at the potential conflicts of interest. Have to be careful on that, but also the return on some of these investments. It was raised, I think it was like 2% on average what they were getting back. Well, I'm getting more of that in my current account, I think. So what are they doing?
Yeah, it's something that we did come across. Harry flagged that up really excellently at Disruption Banking. Now, of course, it's an investment, the kind of investments an SNIB would be making. You would not expect high levels of immediate return. It is a certain element of high risk, high reward. But I would argue that I would expect a better return overall than something less current account.
Yeah. And when you look at some of the investments as well, Dean, it's almost questionable whether they're actually aligned to some of the aims of the bank. I think there seems to be a catch-all that they put anything that doesn't really align with sort of just transition or green economy. They just put in I think it's maybe like an innovation pot, and anything can go in that pot. And when you look at that, you think, well, why is a normal bank not just dealing with that? And it does raise questions around that. But of course, once again, if there was an advisory board, maybe that would give us some answers, but we don't have that.
So you would, before we move on to a couple of other topics that I want to talk to you about, bottom line, absence of the advisory board, should we be worried about the independence of the SNIB in terms of the investments it makes and decision making?
Yeah, definitely. And it was always a frustration to me as well when you have Scottish ministers, they're quick to put out a press release when the Scottish National Investment Bank gives any money. So obviously there's a link, but then if anything goes wrong, it's an independent bank, nothing to do with us. So I think there's serious questions, and I will keep pushing it in Parliament to try and make sure that, I'm not asking for anything that's not meant to be there. This was something set out in legislation. They just need to get on with it and get it done. Because the longer they leave it, there's more and more question marks that will arise, that's for sure.
Yeah, indeed. So the next thing, since you're Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Transport, among other things.
Net zero energy and transport, yep.
Yeah, I suppose I have to ask you a couple of things about ferries and Ardrossan, because it has the ferry. I mean, I'm not going to ask you about the broader ferry fiasco that's unfolding. I think is widely reported enough. I want to focus on a couple of specifically on LNG. Yeah. Now, the Glen Sannox and the Glen Rossa were designed with much fanfare to be powered by dual fuel engines using liquefied natural gas in LNG. Cut emissions and diesel, good for the environment, we're all winners. But it's since come out, the Scottish National Party government has admitted it has not, I'll just use, since I'm an opinion writer, it hasn't a clue about when the LNG tanks will actually be put into service for the boats, when they'll even be built, never mind put into service. So now the fuel will be transported from Qatar, some 8,000 odd miles away. And you did ask the 9th of February about this, this year, how many tankers of liquefied natural gas would be required each week at Troon, because you previously established it would be Troon, that it would come in at Troon Harbour for the vessels 801 and 802, the Sannox and the Rossa. Now, your answer from Fiona Hislop, 26th of February was, quote, CalMac currently expects that there will be 2 tankers a week per vessel to operate this service. So, net zero, how's it going?
Yeah, it's not going very well for them. So as you say, the fuel comes from Qatar. It comes to Isla Grain in Kent, and then it comes in I'd imagine a diesel tanker all the way up to Troon. 960-mile round trip. Probably uses about 120 gallons of diesel to make that journey, and it's just, for me, complete bonkers. But and I guess it's bizarre, when the tanker gets to Troon, then it's going to have to wait for the vessel to come in, then obviously fuel the vessel up before it can come away again, because there's going to be no storage in Troon, because still no one knows where the long-term harbour that's going to be used for the Arden ferry going forward, because where the vessel sails from, meant to sail from at present, Ardrossan, that needs to be upgraded before the new ferries can actually berth there. So I would have thought the original plan would have been upgrade done at Ardrossan. There may have been LNG tanks set there, so tankers don't have to wait for the boat to come in. But that hasn't happened. You would think that the Scottish government have had, these ferries are 5-6 years late already. They've had enough time to put all the infrastructure in place, but that's not in place. Ardrossan's not ready for them. Fuel tanks aren't ready for them. It's going to have to go to Troon on a temporary basis, and the fuel, as you say, is coming from right across the other side of the world to get here.
How can this unfold? Is there a lack of joined up thinking, a lack of anyone in charge of the overall project of building the ferries, delivering the ferries, overseeing the delivery of infrastructure that said ferries will need? Is this just like the botched, or as BBC reporting hinted at, potentially something worse than botched in relation to the procurement originally in Ferguson Marine, where this is political decision making coming ahead of joined up infrastructure?
Yeah, I think when they're buying a vessel, surely the one, you wouldn't buy a car that's too big for the garage that you've got at your house. Part of that original planning should have been taking this into consideration. Yes, they're going to be travelling from Ardrossan. Is the berth capable for your design of your vessel? And that that hasn't been the case. So now we're in a situation where Ardrossan Harbour, it's owned by a private company, Peel Ports. There would have to be significant investment in that port to accommodate the two new vessels. And now there almost seems to be a dispute between Peel Ports and Scottish Government who's gonna pay. And it's been the islanders that suffer for this, because there's no direct train station right at the berth at Troon like there is at Ardrossan. There's no supermarket right at the berth.
We'll come on
just like Ardrossan, so
we will come on to Ardrossan and Peel, I promise.
Right, okay.
There is a lot there as well. But before we do, since we're talking about the ferries directly, before we get onto the harbour and the issue with Peel Ports and Ardrossan and the Scottish Government, what about the delay with the Clyde Hebridean contract? Because I remember the BBC in 16th of November last year reported that, quote, the contract for Clyde and Hebridean's ferry services would be awarded to the current operators, CalMac, without any competitive tendering processes. Now, decision on that has been delayed to the summer, we were told at the time, because they had to do due diligence, look into the potential legal, financial perspectives on whether they can just do that. Now, Fiona Hislop said, Transport Cabinet Secretary for the Scottish Government, quote, "I want to be very clear that this will not be an extension of the status quo." How do you agree that this should not be taken as an extension to the status quo?
Well, I think it will be an extension of the status quo. Basically, the Scottish Government have run down the clock on the contract, so then there's no real option. They can't put it out to tender. It's going to have to be a direct award to CalMac. That's the only feasible thing now, and that was something that the islanders. So as a committee, the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee said they would back a direct award to CalMac if the islanders were supportive of that. But islanders have been quite clear, no, they want to go back out to tender to see what options there would be in terms of running that contract. But it now seems that the Scottish Government have just, as I say, run the clock down, and there's going to be no alternative, but basically just to run the contract on further.
Why? What are your thoughts on why they've ran the clock down? Why the delays?
I think it's the Scottish Government don't like making a decision that might upset some people. So if so the easiest thing for them to do is just to leave it as it is and forget about it and just let it continue. Once they go out to tender, then it'll be different. Maybe bids come back, and then they would have to make a decision, and that's what they don't seem to be very good at just now. So if they don't have to make a decision, they'll leave it as it is, and I think that's regrettable because, you know, as the islanders keep pointing out, they've had enough of the service that they've had enough of old ferries, they've had enough of the service that's been delivered, and they would like to see what else could be done. You know, we've got a different contract in terms of, you know, Shetland and Orkney from Aberdeen. That seems to be working well, although it's an aging fleet as well. So surely this should be given. We should have looked at what options were there.
Yeah, and I think you're correct because, and a personal statement, my own grandparents are originally from the Outer Hebrides, so still have a family croft up there. And I remember trying to my mother and my aunt Morag and my uncle Ian Davidson, former Glasgow Southwest, he was a former MP there, when they were trying to get out to the islands, the ferries were delayed, breaking down. I mean, these are remote island communities. Mm-hmm. These ferry services do matter to the economy in every conceivable way. Because if you want to do up a cottage or a croft, get it rewired, you're probably, or do new tiling on the roofs, you have to get it from the main island, from Scotland. Yep. You get it across. Ferries are really important. Then you get tourism, and you've got the local economy. You know, you've got the whiskey and gin distillery out there. They need, there's all, and it's important. It's not a theoretical.
Yeah, I live in Aberdeen, and I can't imagine the A90 up to Aberdeen. Can you imagine that being every couple of weeks it's closed for a couple of days? Yeah. But that's what the islanders are having to put up with. That sometimes they're being cut off. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's because of weather, but that's
unavoidable.
We can't blame the Scottish Government for everything. But part of the time, it's because the reliability of the CalMac fleet, because they're an aging fleet that is dire need of investment, actually hasn't happened yet.
And speaking of investment, Peel Ports and Ardrossan Harbour. This one is a curious one. Now, Duncan Mackison, interim chief exec of CalMac Ferries, has blasted Peel Ports, who are the owners in question. He accuses Peel Ports of a lack of investment into the Ardrossan facilities. He said, quote, all the facilities, quote, have not been maintained to an acceptable standard. Claims that CalMac have to operate from the Arran service from Troon. Points out that 15.8 million of CalMac has paid to Peel Ports over the last 10 years. Now, to be fair, Peel Ports has put something of their own forward. They've claimed that Ardrossan Harbour is, quote, safe and effective. They also hit back and say CalMac, any work that has had to be done to address damage has been caused by CalMac. Now, a couple of questions raised here. One, ScotGov has said via press release that Ardrossan will retain the status as Arran's mainland port. Is this something we can trust, or is this more government by press release rather than plan?
Well, it must be more government by press release, because there's nothing actually happening to address the issues that Ardrossan Harbour has. There does seem to be a stalemate now between the Scottish Government and Peel Ports, and once again it'll be the islanders that suffer for that. So for me, it's difficult. I can't see any action taking place. I can't see any resolution. I can't see any sort of real dialogue that's happening and an end in sight to this dispute. So it seems to be there's two camps, Peel Port and the Scottish Government. They're entrenched in their view. Peel Ports think the Scottish Government should pay. Scottish Government think it's a private operation. Peel Ports should pay. And there seems to be no progress on that. It just seems to be a standoff just now.
Am I right in thinking that Ardrossan, they've shut down the Irish pier?
Yeah, that's right. Because there was the catamaran that was taken from I think it was the Orkney sailing, that was taken down. It was going to be, I think it was going from there for a while, but then something happened on that berth and had to be closed.
So Peel Port states safe and effective. Do you agree with them?
I couldn't answer that question whether they're safe or effective. If they're saying that, you would like to take them at their word. But in terms of long term, there needs to be investment if we're serious about using that port again, and there needs to be some sort of agreement between Peel Ports and the Scottish Government how that investment is going to take place, what level of investment from the Scottish Government and what level of investment from Peel Ports.
Now, I'm aware of the time, and you've been very generous with it. So one last question. Since we're talking about potential solutions, the stalemate, future investment, there is a campaign to nationalise Peel Port-owned Clyde Port to bring Ardrossan into public ownership. What is a Scottish Conservative position on that?
Yeah, to be fair, most ports around Scotland are sort of like, I think it's sort of trust status. So and that I think that happened a long time ago, and I'm not quite sure why Ardrossan didn't go on that. In terms of the Scottish Conservatives, we just want to see a solution, and if that involves some sort of nationalisation, then that'd be fine, because it's really, we need to have something in place for the sake of our islanders, because what's happening just now is that they're being failed by both sides in this disagreement. So
not ruling anything in or out with nationalisation.
No, we would need to see what the terms of that would be and what it really means to the public purse, because we look at other nationalities. I'm thinking of Ferguson Marine, for example. Some of that hasn't went too well, and I guess that's something we would have to be wary of.
Well, thank you for your time, Douglas, and Or is there anything left unaddressed that you would want to comment on that you think I should have asked about?
No, I just, I think there's a lot going around ferries, and obviously there's the issues with the two vessels that have been delayed for years, and I'm sure you can have many programs about how on earth the wrong piping for LNG was installed in a ferry and things. But there's other things, there's the port stuff, as we've discussed. There's the contract that seems to be getting delayed. There's the small vessel replacement programme that's been delayed. There's the investment into Ferguson's yard, a bit serious about bidding for that work, has been delayed. And it just seems to be there's no decisions being taken by this government. And once again, it's the islanders that will suffer because of this sort of constant delay that we're seeing around all the ferries.
Douglas Lumsden, thank you very much.